There was something about the way Michael's eyes glinted in the firelight. I could not look away. I could feel all of the other kids in the youth group gathered around the fire. I could hear the leaves in the trees up above us rustling. It was that time of year when fall is just starting to set in. The leaves are getting a little bit crisp. The coolness of the night settles down on you. You can feel it at the back of your body at the same time that that fire is warming your face. I could hear the river, the current river down below, just running over the rocks. But I was fixated on the story that Michael was telling that night. I know y'all have heard the stories about how the Miller house is haunted. Has been ever since the Civil War, if not before. Now you probably know that our hometown, it was the prized possession of both armies. 23 times it changed hands, and every time it was occupied by one army or the other. That Miller house served as the hospital. There were boys that never made it off that battlefield. We all know about that. That's the way it goes. There were ones, though, that did. They limped in or they were carried in, and some of them, they never made it off that table where they were sewed up or had a limb sawed off. Those ones who never made it off that table, they say you can hear them. You can hear them if you walk by that house at just the right time. I'm sure you can imagine, and you probably heard those stories too, about those 3 young men that laid down that dare that one time. Everybody was always daring somebody to spend the night in that place. But that time, things did not go well. My grandfather, he was one of those young men. Him, and I know you know Archie, you've seen him wandering around the roads all around town. You've seen Joe, he was the other one, him sitting up there at the courthouse, spitting at that spittoon that hasn't been there for more than 20 years, just waiting for somebody to walk by so he can start telling them a story. Well, that night, the 3 of them were up on that porch and they were smoking cigarettes. You could see the red glow of the tip of those cigarettes, and that's exactly what those 6 kids saw, the ones that had taken that dare. And so that's how it came to be that those 6 kids were standing out there kind of like in just one little mass. You could barely see them in the darkness because it was past midnight by then. They were standing outside that rickety iron gate and staring up at the house, not quite having the nerve yet to push that gate open and walk up that path. Finally, one of those young fellas, they called out, "Whoa, what y'all doing? Just hanging out there like you scared? Bunch of scaredy cats? Let's get this night started, or run on home. We got better things to do." Well, that boy on the football team, nobody was going to call him a scaredy cat. He pushed that gate open and he was through it, and those other kids were right on his heels. There was 2 girls that night and 4 boys, and they made their way up the path again, just like one entity moving toward that porch. And when they got there, they didn't waste any time, those young men. One of them opened up that door and those kids were ushered right into that house. Now, I think that those kids may have been thinking that they were just going to stay there all together throughout the night. But that's not what those young men had in mind for them. They just ushered them right past that and up those stairs, and on the 2nd floor, they began to peel them off one by one. First boy in this room here to the right, and 2nd boy right across the hall from him, and then on down to the next set of rooms. That house, It didn't have any imagination. It was just all squares and rectangles, all right across from each other, right on top of each other. They got those next two kids, boy and a girl, they peeled them off and then on up to the third floor with the last two kids, that boy from the football team, and that little slip of a thing, the one that could sing like an angel. And that's exactly what she did down at the Baptist church choir every Sunday morning. They got those two in their separate rooms across the hall from each other, and then they pulled those ropes out. And they tied those door handles tight, tested them, nothing moving there. And then they went back down to the second floor, same thing, door to door, door to door. And then they made a big production of stomping down those steps to the first floor and out the door, slamming it behind them. And then they waited. They waited because they knew that there was nothing more frightening than a little bit of silence settling down on your shoulders, wrapping itself around you, and they let it do its thing. And then they began to do what they had planned. They pulled out some chains and they started up back into that hallway, up those stairs, rattling those chains as they went. Because I'm going to tell you, it's not just those boys who lost a limb, an arm, or a leg that are said to be haunting that house. The Millers, they owned slaves. And some folks will tell you that they were real good to those slaves. But those people who were enslaved by them, they might have a different story to tell. And if the ghost is anything to judge by. Finally, they started in with the screaming. Ah! My arm! My arm! Oh! My arm, it hurts! Where's my arm? Ah! Give me back my arm! And on they went. Must have seemed like hours to those kids. Those three young men were sure having themselves a good time. And when they stopped to take a little break, wet their throats just a little from where they dried out a little from all that screaming, they heard a sound up on the third floor. Sounded like somebody trying to get that door open, giving it a little kick. Got 'em going now. It was all they could do not to laugh. And then that door went banging open. And they were looking at each other accusing, like who didn't get that door tied right. And then they heard a little skittering, a sound of feet crossing that hallway. That other door went banging open. And then that boy, he said, how'd you get out? How'd you get in here? He said, wait, what are you doing? What are you doing? Get off of me. Get off me. Leave me alone. What are you doing? And then there was a scream that outdid anything that they had manufactured that night. And then they heard a thud, and they knew something wasn't right. Joe, he was the first one up the stairs. He was up the stairs, and by the time my grandpa got up there right behind him, Joe was turning away from that doorway, and he was retching. And my grandfather, he pushed him aside, and he looked in, and he about did the same. He started hollering, Archie, get out, go get us some help now. And Joe, you get down there, get yourself together, get down there and get those kids out of there. Archie, now. And then When he saw that they were doing what he had told him to, he went into that room, and there was that girl. She was hitting that boy from the football team, about twice her size. She was hitting him. He just lay down there in the floor, looked like a puddle of something. It was his own arm. And every time she flung that arm down at him, a spray of blood splattered on the wall across the way. And my grandpa, he shut his eyes. He reached out, opened his eyes enough to see, and grabbed her around the middle, trapped her arms next to her side. And whenever he did manage to talk about it later, it was always after he'd had way too much to drink. He'd talk about how that arm, how it bounced against his leg. It was too late for that boy by the time help arrived. And that girl, she would never ride again. They had to send her up to Farmington State Hospital. And there's been tales about orderlies talking about the ones who worked the night shift, talking about hearing the sound of the voice of an angel coming from that room that she occupied sometimes after midnight. I can't imagine how anyone could ever recover from such a thing as that. And the truth is, not a one of those three young men did. Each one of them dealt with it in their own way, but none of them did it well. You know, Archie, he just wanders now. You've seen him. All around the back roads around Bloomfield, you've seen him. And Joe, just sitting there, sitting in those rocking chairs up at the courthouse. My grandpa, he took to drinking, and he's gone now. But the thing is, that went on and for some years. But the strangest thing is, that year that those three young men turned 28, they'd managed all to form families by then, despite their dysfunction. But the year they turned 28, all of them there within just a few months, first the one of them went screaming mad. You could hear it, the neighbors said, in their house, somewhere after midnight, on the day that they turned 28. First the one, Archie first, and then my grandpa, and then Joe. People got to expecting it by the time Joe. And the thing is, I know y'all have heard that saying about how the sins of the father are visited upon the sons. And that's exactly what happened. The firstborn son of each one of those men, screaming mad, somewhere after midnight, on the day that they turned 28. First my grandfather, then my father. That's how it went in my family. And me, well, I can't say I haven't thought about it. Who wouldn't? But it's my birthday today, 28. I'm 28, and look at me. I'm not going mad. I'm a man of God. I'm not going mad. I'm not like my father. I'm not going mad. I'm not going mad. And he jumped at us. Man, we were all skittering back as fast as we could go. And I kept watching Michael's eyes the whole time I was skittering, and that glint. I didn't care what he was saying. There was something in his eyes. And then he put his head down and he started cackling. And then it turned into that regular old Michael laugh. And when he looked up, he said, "Ha, gotcha." And we all gathered slowly back around that fire, settled ourselves back in, waited for our hearts to stop beating quite so fast. And when I looked down at my watch, I saw it was only 11:47. But Michael didn't go mad that night. It was a few years later. I was already off to college by then, and I found out about it on one of those regular Sunday afternoon conversations that I always had with my family. Me there in that little phone booth on the third floor of the dormitory where I stayed. And we'd been through our regular routine. I'd talk with my dad and my mom and my two brothers, and then my mom was back on again, and I knew we were just doing the wrap-up when she said to me, "Jamie, there's something I need to tell you." "Well, what is it, Mom?" "It's about Michael." What's going on? Michael okay?" "He's in the hospital." "What happened?" He's going to be okay, that's what they say, but he had a nervous breakdown. And I just wanted you to know, because I know you'll hear it sometime, but also I want you just to put him in your prayers. Put him in your prayers, and if you just take a minute and write him a little note, just tell him you're thinking about him. I'm sure he'd appreciate it. "Okay." And then she hung up, and I put the receiver back in the cradle, and I wandered back down the hall to my room, just kind of lost, and thinking about that story that he'd told, and thinking about the way his eyes glinted in that firelight. And I meant to sit down and write him a little note and get that sent off, but I never did it. And then it was Thanksgiving time, and I was back down home, and I saw him there in the church, and I meant to go up and say hello and check in and see how he was, but he was surrounded by all those kids from the youth group, and I just managed to get a hug in. It didn't seem right to bring it up there, and so I didn't. Same thing at Christmas time. And then I was back at school for my next semester, spring, and I remember it being somewhere between Valentine's Day and Easter. I can't remember exactly when, but I knew because when I came down through that hallway and I looked in my mailbox, like I always did, you know, they had that wall of mailboxes there in the hallway, brass with little window inset, and I saw an envelope sitting there sideways in my mailbox, and that never happened. I mean, my grandparents always sent me a card for holidays, so they sent me Valentine's Day cards, they sent me Easter cards. But I couldn't imagine who this was from, so I worked my lock and pulled it out, and there was Michael's name up in the left-hand corner. I had a few minutes before class, so I sat down on one of the couches there and opened it up, and Michael said he was coming up to campus for a meeting, and he wondered if I might have time to have dinner with him the night before the meeting. And that's how I came to be sitting across from Michael, downstairs in the cafeteria of my dorm, feeling so awkward, looking around, like everyone was looking at me, wondering, who's that guy with Jamie? The whole meal went like that. Both of us starting and stopping with our conversation, and me playing with my meatloaf and mashed potatoes and peas, mixing them all up and rarely eating any of it. Just kept staring at that divide there between my tray and Michael's. Till finally there, toward the end of the meal, Michael's voice caught my attention and I glanced up and held his stare. Jamie, I know you've heard about what happened to me. Yeah, Michael, I just got to say something to you. You know, I watched you all those years growing, and you were just a light all through your childhood. And then, as you turned into your teen years, it was like you started to shrink in on yourself, and that light, that glow that always was emanating from you started to dim. And I didn't know what to say. I mean, I know that your family had such high expectations for you, and you were gonna meet them. But it wasn't just them, it was the whole town. And the thing is, nobody's expectations for another person ever fit them. And sometimes they start to press in, and I know something about that. So here's the thing. I just need you to promise me that you will be true to yourself. Because if you don't, what happened to me, it's going to happen to you. And there was something about Michael's eyes, not like that night a few years before, sitting around that campfire, not that same, but intense. Intense, like he had a point he needed to drill into me. And I wasn't really understanding what it was he was trying to say, what it meant. I need you to promise me you'll be true to who you are. I promise. And the thing was, I didn't know what he was asking of me. I didn't know what he was talking about. And I'd like to tell you that it started to dawn on me some time shortly after that dinner. But that's not how it went. In fact, I remember distinctly, it was like 10 years after that. It was like it hit me all at once. And I got it. I knew what he was saying. And I'd like to tell you that that was enough for me to just pop back into myself. It was like I'd been a ghost in my own life. And that's what he was trying to tell me. And you'd think that just getting that, you could make the change, but it wasn't that easy. It's not that I didn't get it. I mean, I was able to bring my whole self here and here and here sometimes. But the one place I never could was back home. It's not that I didn't try. Once I got that I was gay, I came out to my mom. I wrote a letter for my dad because there was no way I wanted to have that conversation straight up. And for the next 2 years after that, it was like I was third person in my father's house. He never would look directly at me. He never would speak directly to me. And then there was that night that I called my mom after not having talked with her for a few weeks. And in the intervening time, my roommates had not paid the phone bill. It had been cut off, and my mom apparently had been trying to reach me rather frantically, couldn't remember where I worked, and she happened to be in the shower when I called. And that was the first time that my dad talked to me directly. And I know that if he had not kept me on that phone, there would have been hell to pay. And that kind of just broke that spell. But 2 years is a long time, and it's hard to take that risk to bring yourself again when you've been pushed out, when you did. And so I just brought the pieces of myself that I knew that they loved whenever I went home after that. I'd like to say that it didn't last all that long, but the truth is it was years. In fact, it was just a few years ago when things changed. I was sitting in Sunday service at Center for Spiritual Living in Kansas City when my phone started ringing in church. I almost always turn the ringer off. I reached under my seat, pulled out my backpack, and I started zip, 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 and trying to find which pocket I'd put it in this time. And finally, there it was. I pulled it out and I silenced it. Before I slid it back in, I looked over, and it was Laura, my friend, and so I made a note to call her back when the service was over. But I got to talking afterwards, and I was on my way to the store before I remembered that she had called. And so I very carefully reached over and flicked my screen on and flicked my phone part on, and I got the voicemail going. Jamie, I just heard about the shooting in Orlando. I'm calling to see how you are. I could not breathe. I moved my car wheel over to the side of the road. I jammed it into park. And I started poking at the callback. And finally, the phone started ringing. And then there was Laura's voice. Laura, what's going on? She said, well, I thought you would have heard. It's all over the news. I didn't watch the news. What's happening? Because all I could think about was the fact that my friend Julianne was down in Florida, and Laura was calling to see how I was. And there was that shooting in Kansas City that had taken place at the Jewish Community Center just a year or two before. And my friend Julianne is Jewish. All that inside of me. And then she told me there was a shooting down at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. And 49 people from the LGBTQ community were massacred. And in that moment, I could breathe again, because I knew that Julianne would not have been one of them. She wouldn't have been there. I didn't understand why Laura had called to check on me. Later that afternoon, when I got home from the store, I called Julianne, and she was telling me that she was okay, that she knew about the massacre, of course, but I could tell by the sound of her voice that she couldn't really be open with me at that point. And so I let it go, and I just told her I'd see her the next day when I picked her up from the airport. And so when I had her suitcase in my trunk, and she was sitting there buckling in, and I was pulling out of the parking spot, she started telling me about what it had been like to be down there in that house with every TV in the place on, loud, and nothing but coverage of that massacre. And nobody in her family asking her how she was. And I didn't get it, because it never would have occurred to me that my family might call and check on me after something like that had happened, and they hadn't. The next morning, I was driving to work and NPR was on, and of course the coverage was still going of the massacre. And they were interviewing one of the first responders who had walked into that nightclub after the music had been silenced, after the gunfire had ceased. And he talked about how horrific it was to be standing there in that dance hall with the incessant sound of cell phones ringing all around him. And in that moment, I got it. And I got that there was nothing that I could do to bring back one of those voices that we had lost that night. Not one of them. But I also got that there was one voice that I could do something about because I had silenced it myself. And so I began the work to bring my voice back to life. I started digging down inside myself and excavating everything that I had shoved down, every conversation that I had avoided because to have entered it would have made it clear that I was gay. I started remembering every pronoun that I had muffled out in a conversation because to have spoken it clearly would have revealed that I was gay. I began pulling all of that back up into the air and breathing into it, breathing into my own life. And I made a lot of progress. I began to join conversations and bring myself and talk about my life in ways that made it clear that I was gay. And nobody batted an eye. And I worked hard for 3 or 4 months. And then it was time to go down for a visit to my family. And I found myself driving across the state from Kansas City. And when I got to St. Louis, which was the northern border of my childhood, it was like I was driving into a membrane that was not letting me enter freely. And when I finally broke through, I could feel all of those pieces of myself that I had pulled back lying scattered in the road behind me. So that by the time I got down to southeast Missouri, I was as silent as I had ever been in that place. And when I got there, my mom had all my favorite foods just ready to put on the table. My brother and his family were out, and my dad and mom and I, all of us, we sat around that table that we had sat around so many times during my childhood. And we talked and we laughed together just like we always did when I went to visit. And when we had finished our dinner, we cleared the table, we put the food up, loaded up the dishwasher, and we pulled out the games. And we played together, just like we did every time I went down to visit. A couple of days later, my little brother arrived, and my dad decided to take advantage of having all 3 of his children together for the first time in about 5 years. So he gathered us back around that table the next morning after breakfast dishes were cleared off, and he told us he was going to talk to us about what he wanted done with his stuff when he died. He looked around the table at all of us, and then he looked right at me, and he said, "Jamie, your mom and I, we've talked, and we would like for you to have the house." "But Dad, I'm not coming back." "But Bloomfield needs you," he said. And I couldn't quite form any words to respond, and before anything occurred to me, he continued, Kansas City doesn't need you. Bloomfield needs you. And in that moment, this thing, this beautiful gift that my dad was trying to give me, felt more like something that took more away from me than I had ever offered him to do. And I sat there, frozen, my body frozen, my face frozen, my throat frozen. And I cannot tell you anything else that was said during that meeting. I sat there as I had done so many times when I was a kid, there in body, but gone somewhere else completely. When I could finally get up and leave that meeting without anyone realizing just how gone I had already been, I went up to my room, the room that I had occupied most of my growing up, and I did something that I had never done before in that place. I shut the door behind me, I curled up in a ball on my bed, and I sobbed. My whole body racked with it. And when I finally reached a point where my body began to still, and I could trust my voice, I picked up my phone and I did something I had never done before in that place. I called 3 of my friends in succession, and I asked them to come into that place with me and hold me there in my grief. And they did. I had 2.5 days to go before I could leave gracefully. And when the morning finally came, I was up early, I had my car packed, the dew was still on the grass, and I was sitting there with my engine idling. My mom and my dad, they were standing right outside my car door. My window was rolled down, and they were kind of leaning in, like they always did when I was getting ready to leave. And my mom was telling me how much she had loved having me home. And my dad, he was asking me when I would be coming back next, just like they always did. And I could feel their love for me just flowing into my car, in through that window, and filling up my car and suffocating me. Finally, my mom and dad, they straightened up and they stepped back, and I put my car in drive, and I started down their driveway out to the road. And I could feel their love trailing behind me, holding me, bonding me to them like a cord. And it began to stretch thinner and thinner as I drove, but it wasn't until I got to St. Louis that it dispersed and let me drive free back into my life. It took me 3 months to recover from that visit. It took me 2 more before I could think about going back down. But there I was, sitting in front of my computer screen, looking at my calendar, mapping out my summer plans, and I knew that if I did not get down there, that it would hurt their feelings. And that's how I found myself driving back down to my hometown to visit my family on Memorial Day weekend. And when I got there, my mom had all my favorite foods ready to put on the table. And my brother and his family were out, and we all sat down and we ate supper together like we always did when I came for a visit. And when we were done, we played games together, and we laughed and we talked and we enjoyed each other's company, just like we always did when I went down for a visit. And that's how the weekend went. And it wasn't until the night before I was to head back to Kansas City that my mom and my dad and I were alone there together, sitting around that kitchen table that we had eaten so many meals together at. And we were just about done with our meal when my father looked over at me and said, "So, Jamie, now why is it you are going to D.C. again? I mean, besides to visit your brother." And there it was, the first ever invitation from my father to bring my full self into his home. And so I took a deep breath. "We're going for the LGBTQ march." And my dad said, "What?" All right, louder and prouder. Another deep breath. "We're going for the gay and lesbian march." And my dad said, "What?" And I could feel my mom sitting beside me, trying not to laugh, because she knew that she was going to have to repeat what I'd said in just the right decibel that he could hear. And I saw when her words crossed that invisible barrier, and he heard. His face, the shake of his head, just like he did when he was disgusted. Well, I hope you don't end up on TV. And so, when I found myself standing on the corner of 17th and I, there in Washington, D.C., surrounded by all of my gay and lesbian and bi and trans family, all colors of the human rainbow, all dressed in all the colors of the rainbow, I looked at those signs that people were holding, commemorating each of the lives that we had lost in the Pulse nightclub massacre. And I honored those folks with a moment of silence. And then I began to read all of the signs proclaiming our pride in who we are, and watching everyone celebrating joyfully. And I took lots of pictures, and I plastered them all over Facebook, just in case I had not made the nightly news. So, my dad and I, obviously, we've had our moments. And yet, through all of that, I have come to understand that he has always loved me. I spent so many years shielding myself and protecting myself from those hard things. And it took me a long time to realize how much of the good things I was holding out as well. My dad, he had fallen in the spring, right when the pandemic had started. And it had occurred to me in that moment that I might not ever get to see him alive again. And so I began thinking about all the ways in which my dad and I are alike. And then in the fall, I'm part of a group that works with teens to help them tell their stories. It's part of the Kansas City Writing Project. And the National Writing Project reached out to us, and they were doing a collaboration with the National Park Service. And the theme of their 2-week-long workshop series that they were doing was Stories Around the Campfire. And they were wondering if we would put together a workshop for them. And so I was talking with our director, and she was saying, well, Stories Around the Campfire, and we usually do, our focus is on personal stories and social justice type things. And so I was like, well, ghost stories. And she's like, ghost stories, personal, I don't get it. And so I finally convinced her that ghost stories are the perfect vehicle for social justice stories. And so we just left it that what we would ask of the kids and the adults who were participating is that they would create a story that was from their own culture. And so that reminded me of that book of Civil War ghost stories that I had read some years back. I love ghost stories. And as it turns out, I have a thing for Civil War ghost stories because the truth is, I was raised on the Civil War. My hometown, it changed hands 23 times during that war. It's out up there on the top of Crowley's Ridge, and for, 7 miles or more around that, there was nothing but swampland to the east and the south and the west. And so that's why they focused so much on my hometown. But it wasn't just that. My dad, he was still fighting that Civil War, I swear, when I was a kid. Every month or so, on a Sunday evening, he and his friends would gather at our house. We'd clear off the kitchen table, and they would spread out their maps. All over that table, they would pull out their notebooks full of notes about battle strategies and what should have happened here and what could have happened here, and they would go over it all. And I was sure that one of those times I was going to hear like a rebel yell of jubilee that they had finally worked out the perfect strategy and the course of the war had changed. Every summer, my dad, he would get us up before the sun even thought about rising. He and my mom, they'd pack up our luggage in the car and they'd rouse my brothers and I out of bed and pile us into the back seat of the car. They would get in the front and we'd be off down the road to another Civil War battlefield. Shiloh, Pea Ridge, Fredericksburg, Antietam, Gettysburg, twice. There we would be, roaming around those empty battlefields for as long as my dad's stamina held out. If we were lucky, at the end of that time, we would get to stop by the gift shop and we'd get to pick something out, the three of us. And one of those times I picked out a little rebel cap and I wore that thing proudly. And then, after we left the battlefield, we would check into our motel and my brothers and I, we would pull on our swim clothes and we would be out to the motel pool and tussling over who got to use my dad's beach towel. The one that had the old rebel soldier on it, holding his flag and declaring, "Hell no, we will never forget." On Sundays, when we were home, we went to Sunday school every week. And there we would sing, "Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the children of the world." And my dad, he knows his family history going back to that war. He told me one time about his great-great-grandfather and how when he was a kid, he was wandering around those woods with his little brother and sister in tow, and how they could hear the shots from the battles going on around them, and they stumbled across this camp that the fire was still going and the breakfast was still cooking over that fire, and they swooped in and they had themselves the best breakfast they had had in a long time. Those were the same woods and hills and creeks that my brothers and I had played in when we were kids. We had fished for minnows in those creeks. We had wandered all over those hills, doing our own battles, building our own forts. And we had shot off fireworks all around the 4th of July every year. Same place. And there was something tying us to that, and something about my dad's stories that tied me back to that place Not just when I had lived it, but all the way back to the time that my great-great-great-grandfather had wandered in the same place. It was some years before I understood the contradictions in wearing that rebel cap and singing Jesus Loves the Little Children. And it was even more years before I understood that an all-white town, it doesn't happen by chance. By then, I'd stopped roaming the woods with my brothers, and I'd started to hang out on the edges of the girl gatherings, feeling awkward in my body, like I didn't belong in my own body, like I didn't belong in those gatherings, like I didn't belong in that town, like I didn't belong in my own family. Finally, I graduated and I was off to college. And that summer, after my first year there, I got myself a job at the Y Camp out in Colorado. And I spent the summer hanging out with the northern girls. Southern girls, they made me real uncomfortable, and all I can think is that it just reminded me of how I was nothing like the Southern belle that my father had desired me to be. When the summer ended, when the job ended, there wasn't any time to head back down home to my folks, so I just went straight back to campus, and it was Thanksgiving before I had a chance to make it back down home. And I swear, I had not even been in the house a couple of hours when my dad looked straight at me and said, "You sound like a Yankee." And I knew that there was no worse thing that he could have said to me. But the thing is, my dad and I, we're a lot alike, too. And my dad has brought so much beauty into the world as well. He's the one that built the planter around that old oak tree there in the side yard of that house that he and his brother and father and mother built together. The house that my grandparents left so that my family would have a place to live, and that's part of where I grew up. He's the one that planted the irises in that planter and tended them. He's the one that planted the rose bushes. And both of us love that kind of beauty, but he's the one who fosters it. My dad and I both love to sing, and my dad has a beautiful Irish tenor voice. He used to sing in the church choir, and they would give him a solo at least once a month. And me, I sang passionately in that same choir, if not as beautifully. But I love to sing, just like my dad. My dad and I both love knowing our family history. It's like we both are connected to the land through that history, that we are connected so much further back, and that we are rooted there through those stories that he has shared with me. And my dad and I both like history now that I have come to realize that history isn't just a bunch of empty battlefields and a bunch of dates you have to memorize, it's stories. And truth be told, neither my dad or I like anybody telling us what to do or how to think. And so, I'm sitting there and I'm remembering that ghost story that I had read several years before in that book of ghost stories. And I pulled it out and I'm flipping through it. And when I got to that story, the one that I remembered so well, it was like I stepped right into it, like I was a part of it. And there I stood in the hills and woods, not the ones around my house, probably somewhere over in Tennessee or Virginia or maybe Pennsylvania. But I could see the battle as it took place. I could see that old soldier dressed in a ratty gray uniform step out from behind that tree and raise his rifle to his shoulder and sight across the battlefield. And I could see that young soldier there over right across the way, right where he was pointing, all dressed in his blue uniform. And I saw how that young man's hair fell across his forehead, just like that of the old man, same color, same blue eyes there, same set to their jaws, same set to their shoulders. And he raised his rifle in response, and you couldn't tell which one of them fired first. The echo of their shots were so close together. And I watched as both of them jerked back and fell to the ground face up. I watched as the red blossomed on their chests. And then I watched as their bodies began to turn to mist and fade up into that darkening sky, just as they had done every July 2nd since 1863. Or that's what the story said. And as I watched, I wondered how any of us was ever going to find our way home. And then I remembered those stories that my dad had shared with me, not just the ones about his great-grandfather, but about his own childhood, and how often he had been misunderstood, and that he had gotten in trouble for responding to things that his brother had done. And I remembered how those stories opened my heart. And I remembered a few of my forays into sharing stories of my own and the way my dad listened. And it struck me how stories are like maps. Maps that can help me find my way back home to the man who never let me go.